In the story of Daniel, we find that he worked with 4 kings, and apparently each one of them gave royal favors to him, just because he was such an outstanding man of God and served them so well. Today I want to talk to you about Daniel, a man of God with favors from kings. As we go through the book of Daniel, we find some fascinating facts. And something I want to lift up to you today is for you to see how God had favor on Daniel from the kings with whom he worked. Now, the reason this is fascinating is to go back and see again Daniel's situation. I've shared this with you throughout the week, but I want you to understand it. Here he is, as a Jewish young man, and then, of course, growing up over the years, in a foreign country. He was an exile. King Nebuchadnezzar had taken the Jews from their land into the land of Babylon, and this is where Daniel lived. And while he was there, all sorts of incredible things happened to him. Along with him were his 3 outstanding friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who we talked about yesterday morning. And all 4 of these men had a tremendous faith in God. And this is where the difference came in their lives. It's quite obvious that God's hand was on them, and he was working in their lives at all times. But you've got to really understand that position, that they were away from home and could even have given up possibilities of living, but they really didn't, and they lived in victory at all times. So Daniel worked with 4 kings, and first of all, on Monday we saw that King Nebuchadnezzar was in control. And starting off in chapter 1, we find that Daniel entered the king's service. We find in verse 19, and I read this to you the other day, the king talked with them. He found none equal to Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they entered the king's service. With his friends, they were there and they remained there. In fact, it says in verse 21 of chapter 1 of Daniel, and Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. So he saw 3 kings come and go before Cyrus. He worked under King Nebuchadnezzar, he worked under his son, King Belshazzar, and then under King Darius. Now, some other things happened in this situation. Daniel received promotion to the highest position while he was working with King Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel chapter 2 and verse 48, it tells us, then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Now, you've only got to think of what's happened. Here he is as an exile in Babylon. Here he is in favor with the king. And at this particular point, he had promotion because he had interpreted a vision that Nebuchadnezzar had. As you read the story, it's absolutely plain that God had revealed the interpretation to him. And once Daniel had that, he went to King Nebuchadnezzar, who was so thrilled that he just gave him promotion over everybody else. But when you're in that position, you can be quite sure that jealousy begins to work against you. Daniel remained in the royal court with King Nebuchadnezzar, and he brought in his friends, because in verse 49, moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. His 3 friends were involved with him. They all worked together. It's fascinating, isn't it, if you think about it? Foreign exiles, God was with them, and they were favored in that land. But the story of Daniel doesn't stop there. We did find yesterday that jealousy came against his friends, and some of the men tried to get rid of him, get rid of all of them. But it didn't work like that. God's hand was on them. Now, when King Nebuchadnezzar died, we find that Belshazzar, his son, took his place. And Daniel was still in the picture. First of all, Belshazzar put on an incredible feast. It was one of utter luxury. And what he did, and where he sinned, he took some of the things that had been brought from God's temple in Jerusalem, and he began to use them for that feast. And as far as God was concerned, that was an absolute no-no. You don't use God's consecrated vessels just to have a good time. So, in the middle of the feast, writing appeared on the wall. Let me read to you from Daniel 5, verse 5. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. He was scared stiff. Belshazzar had no idea what was going on. Someone said to him, because nobody could interpret the writing, that this man Daniel could. So he sent for Daniel, and Daniel did. God gave Daniel a total interpretation, and basically it was this: God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. This was the end of Belshazzar. Nevertheless, verse 29 says, Then at that Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, and a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Well, what promotion! But that didn't last too long. Verse 30. That very night, King Belshazzar was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Now, apparently, Darius and Daniel got on better than any of the other kings. We find in chapter 6 and verse 3 these words: Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Here are those qualities in Daniel again, noticed by the king and other officials. He was just outstanding. His promotion caused an incredible jealousy. The jealousy was so bad that these men got their heads together. All the officials got together, and they decided that they simply had to trap Daniel and get him out of the way. And what they did, they used flattery with King Darius. They felt that if he could fall for that, they could get rid of Daniel. It says in verse 7 at the end, he's talking to these royal advisors, and they all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Do you see what they've done? They've taken King Darius and put him in God's place. And straight away, Darius is in trouble, because he fell for this flattery, and he signed this decree, and he totally forgot his friend Daniel, because if he had thought, he would have known that Daniel would not comply with this. And Daniel didn't. We find that Daniel went to his room, as he always did, and 3 times a day he opened his windows towards Jerusalem, and he knelt down and prayed. And these officials were watching for this, and they went and told Darius. They said, King Darius, you've made a decree, and there's one man who's not fulfilling it. It's Daniel. Darius was terribly upset. He realized what he'd done. He'd been trapped into getting rid of Daniel. So Daniel was to be thrown into the lion's den. Listen to what the king thought of Daniel's God. Verse 16. So the king gave the order that they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. And then in verse 18, Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating, and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. This is what he thought of Daniel. But don't forget, we saw yesterday that God's the God of the impossible. And God kept Daniel perfectly safe all night with the lions. Verse 21, The king came to the lion's den and called to Daniel, and Daniel answered, O king, live forever. My God sent his angels, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in the sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king. And the king was overjoyed. You see, you can't find anything impossible with our God. Yesterday we saw Daniel's friends thrown into a fiery furnace, and nothing happened to them. This time we find Daniel thrown into a lion's den, and nothing happens to him. Our God can do absolutely anything. And once again the favors were given to Daniel. Verse 28, Then King Darius wrote to all the people and nations and men of every language throughout the land, May you prosper greatly. And of course, straight away, we find that Daniel had a special position. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He's once more promoted. What is the Bible saying to us in all these situations for Daniel? First of all, notice that God's hand was with Daniel in King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and Daniel kept in touch with God at all times. We find this in chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. The Bible says this to us. He urged them to plead for mercy, this is his three friends, from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed. During the night the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. You remember, King Nebuchadnezzar had had a vision. No one could interpret it, and he said if anybody could not be found, all the wise men of the land were going to be put to death. This included Daniel and his friends. So they went to God, and they asked for God's help, and God gave Daniel the interpretation. God is always there. With Belshazzar, again it was interpretation. The hand wrote on the wall. No one could understand what was written until God told Daniel. Once again, our God is in control. And now, in chapter 6, with King Darius, we find Daniel's devotion to God, an absolute lesson for every one of us. Listen to chapter 6 and verse 13. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree that you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. You could not faze Daniel in his walk with his God. What about you and me? Are we as clear as that? Are we as trusting? Do we know God as God of the impossible?